Making selections in Modo is possibly the most important skill you can have in order to use Modo effectively. If you can't make selections, you can't do jack in Modo. So we're going to devote an entire video just to understanding selections and the real power of making selections in Modo. So I'm going to open up a default file here. If you look in your project directory for this series, you're going to find an Audi shell LXO. Let's open that up. And this is just a very basic shell of a car body to play with selection modes and just general modeling tools. So let's start by looking at the basics. We've got vertex, edge, and poly selection modes. These are known collectively as our component selection modes, because the component geometry is the constituent geometry of an item being like a mesh item like this one. You can think of items like layers. In some programs they're called layers, in some programs they might be called nodes. There are different ways to think of these, but regardless, an item is a container for geometry in this case, or at least a mesh item is. And inside it you'll have verts, edges, and polys. We also have material selection mode, we'll get to that in a minute, and items selection mode. Now we do have two others, pivot and center selection modes. Those are a little bit more advanced. We'll get to those later. But that adds up to a total of 7 distinct selection modes, which might kind of make your head spin if they weren't so doggone useful. They're actually just great. It makes it very easy and very fluid to work with extremely complex things in Modo. Let me show you what I mean. So if I go to vertex selection mode, you can, of course, jump in here and click some vertices to select them. I'm going to hold Shift and drag over some vertices. And by the way, you have to be quite accurate when clicking a vertex, unless you drag over it. So I tend to drag over them, just kind of scrub over them with your mouse, and that makes it very quick to select them. Now I've selected a whole bunch of vertices here, but those actually implicitly could also define an edge selection mode or a poly selection mode. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I hold the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, you'll see that my selection modes change to conversion buttons. So I can come over here to Convert to Polygons, and you'll see that vertex selection's implicit polygon selection has been converted. Similarly, I can take the same selection, hold Alt, and convert to edge selection, and we get all of the constituent edges of that selection. So it's very quick to go from vertex to edge to poly selection modes, and just by holding the Alt key when you change modes, which is extremely powerful. Also, note that you can change modes very quickly without using the 1, 2, and 3 keys on the keyboard, and without hitting the buttons themselves. You can also just right-click on any piece of geometry. So right now I'm in poly selection mode. You can see because I'm highlighting over polygons. But if I want to select a vertex, I just mouse over the vertex and right-click, and then hit Escape to drop the right-click menu, and you'll see that it has selected a vertex for me. So if you right-click on a piece of geometry, it's going to switch you to the selection mode implicit in what you right-click. Okay, so that's a quick way to switch between modes as well. One last way to switch between modes is to hit the space bar. A lot of people like to do that. Just by hitting space, it's going to toggle between vertex, edge, and poly selection modes. I don't do that often, but a lot of people find that really useful, so whichever you like. Another thing that's incredibly powerful when dealing with geometry within a mesh item is that you can do pattern selection. So if I select a poly, and I shift-click the next poly in a loop, then if I hit the up arrow, it's going to continue that selection down the loop. If I hit the down arrow, it's going to come back. So I can very easily expand or contract a selection along a loop just by hitting the up and down arrows respectively. I can also go to edge selection mode, do the same thing, select 2 edges to define a loop, and go back and forth along that loop. They can also be parallel within the same loop, and that works just the same. So it's very, very quick and easy. I can do this with vertices as well. It always works the same way. But watch this. If I go to poly selection mode here, select a poly, and then skip one, and select the poly 2 doors down by shift-clicking it, then hit the up arrow, it's going to continue that same pattern across the body. That is really cool. Now, this is a selection method that I use constantly, and that actually is just ingenious. I really, really love this. And it doesn't have to be every other poly. You can skip 2, and it'll skip every 2. You can skip 3, and it will skip every 3. So you can really fine-tune your selections very quickly and get patterns of selections very quickly by using the up and down arrows. Very, very powerful. We also established that in edge selection mode, clicking an edge, and double-clicking an edge, I should say, selects the entire loop, right? And if we select an edge and hit the L key on the keyboard, that too will select the implicit loop based on the edge selected. Now, if I grab a poly selection mode, click a poly, and shift-click the next poly in the loop, I can then hit L and get the same result. So the L key works in all 3 selection modes. If I select 2 vertices and hit L, I will get the entire selection. Very, very cool. Now, with edge selection mode, we can actually do this with more than one edge at a time, as we've demonstrated. If I select 3 edges, each edge has its own implicit loop. So I can just hit L and it will give me the entire loop for all of those edges, which is very nice. And that's something you can't do in the other selection modes. Another thing you may find really useful is to head to, say, polygon selection mode, for example, and select all of the hood polygons. I'm going to hold the Shift key, just expand this selection down by painting all the way across this model. And let's say that I want to be able to access this selection later on for use when modeling or whatever. So if I right-click while those polys are selected, I can head down to Add to Selection Set. We can name this our Hood Polys. And now, if I deselect, do some other stuff, come back later, right-click, we recall selection set, choose the Hood Polys selection set, hit OK, and we get that. So this is something you're probably going to use quite frequently as well, because often there are pieces of geometry that you frequently need to select all together. For example, this wheel well. We might right-click that, save that as a selection set. We'll call this front left. We'll call this wheel well front left. How about that? And now, whenever we need to later on, recall selection set. We can choose our wheel well front left, OK, and now we can get to work on that particular piece of geometry. Another thing that you can do to group geometry is just use material sets. So for example, if I grab my windscreen here, just by dragging over all these polys, I'm going to control drag over these others to refine that selection a little. I'll hit M for material, and let's call this our windscreen. And we can make it purple. That's totally fine. Hit OK. We have now 2 materials in this mesh item. We have this purple windscreen material, and we have the gray default material. Now let's say later on I decide I want to select those windscreen polys. Well, I can just go to my materials selection mode, go to that area, click it, and that's actually selected the material itself. You'll see the material properties here, so I can change the color if I like, whatever it is I need to change about the material. Or, with this selected, I can hold the Alt key and convert that to a poly selection. So you can very easily see how this might work. We can create different regions of polygons using material tags, and then be able to select those interactively using the materials selection mode. There's one more nuance of selecting things in Modo that I want to hit on before we move to item selection modes, and that is this curious fact that in Modo, if nothing is selected, everything is selected. That's kind of an odd thing. I'll say it again. If nothing is selected, right, like right now, then everything is selected. That means if I hit the Move tool right now, it's going to move everything because nothing is selected. Therefore, everything is selected. Whereas if I escape that, select some stuff, then do the Move tool. Now we're just moving the selected polys. Okay? So, once again, if nothing is selected, everything is selected. That means you have to be careful. If nothing is selected and you run the bevel tool, then it's beveling everything all at once. And if we turned off group polys, that's going to be even weirder. Okay? So just pay attention to that. Keep that in mind as you're working. So now let's talk about items selection modes. And for that, let's close up this document and start from a blank one. I'm going to hold the Shift key and then click each of the primitives in turn. We'll add a cube, then a sphere, then a cylinder, then a cone, then a torus. That should be enough. Now we want to move these things around, and we have different ways of doing it. So let's go to Items Selection Mode. And you'll see that this is pretty straightforward. I'll select the cylinder just by clicking it, W for move it over. Then I'll select the cube, and I can actually select through in this case. This is called select through, where the tool is still running. I don't even drop the tool. I just click another thing, and it lets me do it. So I don't ever have to drop the tool. I can just click the next thing and move it. Great. Escape to drop the tool, and we're off. Now, in the Model tab, by default, the selected item will be shaded, and all the background items, or inactive meshes, will be wireframe. That's actually a preference. We can set that in the viewport properties, but we don't need to change it right now. The point is, each item is only active when it is selected. If I shift-click, I can select more than one item, and now those are all selected and therefore all active. By that I mean if I switch to a component selection mode, like poly selection mode, because all three of these are active, I can select the polys from any one of them. I can't select polys from inactive meshes, or background meshes, or unselected meshes, however you want to think of it. So, in item selection mode, we choose the mesh item we want to work on at any given time, just by clicking on it. Now, the same rules apply as in component selection modes. I can drag over multiple items to select them using paint selection. So there's a lot that we can do here that's pretty much exactly the same as working with components. Also, just like components, we have the ability to lasso select items. So we can simply deselect by selecting one thing. Now I will middle mouse button and lasso the stuff that I want to select, and add those things to my selection. That's actually true in component selection modes as well. Now, right mouse will actually only select visible polygons. Notice that the back faces of this were not selected when I used the right mouse lasso. Using the middle mouse lasso selects through everything, so you can actually get an X-ray selection. And that's actually the case in item selection mode as well. So we can use right or middle, and in most cases, they will both work with items just fine. Also, with the lasso, if I right-click, you can head down to Lasso Style, and notice we have some other options, including rectangle, circle, and ellipse. If I grab rectangle selection mode now, I can select using a box, a little bit more like in, say, Adobe Illustrator or something like that. I can also use a circle, which in item selection mode might not be that impressive. But if I go to top view here, and let's pretend I'm in poly selection mode, I want to select these radial polys on this sphere, that's when the circle lasso gets really useful. I can actually circular lasso just the loops of polys that I want. It's actually a very, very useful thing to be able to do. But generally speaking, I tend to leave the lasso style on lasso and then only change it when I need to. Finally, there is this concept of item centers. This is a pretty advanced topic. It's something that I usually don't introduce to students right off the bat, so I'm really going to save the nuances of this for a more advanced tutorial. But suffice it to say that each one of these items has its own center. So if I click on an item, you'll see that its position is currently z negative 2.5 meters approximately. And when I move this around, the item properties are changing. If I change to polygon selection mode and then move, in the viewport, the change is going to be ostensibly similar. It's going to look basically the same. The difference is, you'll notice that my transform positions have not changed. I'm still just sitting at z negative 2.5, and that's because I haven't moved my item. The item itself is staying put. We're just moving the geometry within the item. Now, if that kind of nested thinking drives your brain crazy, don't think about it. It's okay, you don't need to for now. We can always move the item centers. We can fix that stuff later on. So if you're just working and you just want to get started in Modo and this kind of stuff freaks you out, don't worry about it. But if you're the kind of person who understands more nodal thinking, understands that each one of these items has its own center and that the geometry within it exists relative to said center, we could change to center selection mode, and you would see where the center of each one of these things is. And believe it or not, we can even move those centers, and that's going to blow your brain right there. We also have pivots. Pivots exist relative to centers, and we can select those and move them as well, which is an extremely advanced topic and something that we're not going to get into at all for quite some time. Okay, so generally speaking, in review, we're going to use item selection mode to select the item we want to work on. We're going to move to the component selection modes, i.e. vertex, edge, and poly selection modes to select the stuff within them. And that, folks, is pretty much what you need to know to get started. Okay? So let's actually do something.